Hello, hello. You've made it to Webinar Wednesday. Today, we're going to be focusing on how to talk about tough stuff with important people. This webinar series is brought to you by Can Do Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Paige Kennan. I'm a programs manager here at Can Do, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. I'd also like to thank our generous sponsors for supporting this year's webinar series. Thank you. Joining us this evening is clinical psychologist Amber Landers, as well as speech language pathologist Betty Mathew. Thank you both for joining us tonight. Amber, I'll go ahead and give it to you so you can introduce to us what we're talking about this evening.
All right. So the learning objectives for today is we're going to talk about changes in the brain that can affect communication, particularly related to symptoms of MS. We are going to talk about the importance of clear communication and also listening and how those two things go together, especially when dealing with tough topics. We're going to share some tips for sharing feelings, needs, and requests, which can be really difficult across different types of relationships, even including not family members, and a few strategies and tips, quick strategies and quick tips for resolving conflict and maybe for hopefully preventing some conflict in the first place, if possible.
All right, thanks, Amber. I'm Betty. I'm a speech therapist. I'm based out of Atlanta. So I'm going to start off our discussion tonight about just talking about what's happening in the brain with MS. So some of you, this may be a general review. For some of you, it may just be brand new information. So I'm going to just kind of go over a brief overview so that way we just have a general understanding. Okay. All right. So the basic definition or the basic idea of what MS is, it's a disease of the central nervous system, and that consists of your brain, your spinal cord, and your optic nerves. Okay, so when you have MS, it results in damage, which is lesions that occur in these particular areas, and it can vary from person to person. I don't think any one person has the same, type and extent of lesions as the next person. So I think that's something that's unique about MS. It just looks different on everybody. The next thing is MS can contribute to just change or atrophy in the brain. So that just means like shrinking of brain matter. This happens in people with no MS, like normal aging. So it's not something that's very unique to MS. It's just a part of the disease progression. And then as a result, cognitive and emotional changes can occur. This can be related to where the lesions are, the number of the lesions, and there's a lot of different factors that go into the impact it can have on your cognition and emotional well-being. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what changes are actually happening. Now, there's a variety of changes that can happen, but tonight we're just going to focus on the cognitive and emotional changes because that's going to primarily impact having these tough conversations. Let's first go into the cognitive changes. So there's a list here on the screen. You can have memory, meaning maybe not able to recall information like dates, conversations you've had, what you need to get done, what somebody told you. It can impact your attention, so your ability to stay focused. Maybe you're trying to have a conversation with someone and you can't keep up. Maybe it's a group conversation and there's a lot of people talking at one time, so it's really hard to stay focused and really listen and pay attention. It can also mean like you're just working on a task and you just can't finish it because you're getting distracted by something else in your environment. The other cognitive change is information processing. What that basically means is how you're taking in information. Oftentimes with MS, you can have slowed processing, meaning you need extra time to both understand what you're hearing and then being able to respond back in a conversation. The next thing is word finding. I hear this is a very common thing that a lot of my patients tell me about is you know what you want to say and you can't get it out. And that can really impact having a tough conversation, like talking about your MS to other people. you may know exactly what you want to say and how to describe, but for some reason, it's just not coming out the way you wanted to. And that can be extremely frustrating. And then the other change that can happen is with your executive functions. And those executive functions are basically your ability to plan, organize, manage time, even regulate how you feel, understanding your audience. Those are your executive functions. So those are all the cognitive changes. The other changes that are happening can relate to having anxiety, depression, emotional ability, and then changes in your self-esteem. So the general idea here is the cognitive and the emotional changes are all impacting one another. So you may be having cognitive changes, and then that's resulting in this anxiety and depression and changes in how you feel about yourself. Or it could be the other way around. MS can result in anxiety and depression, and then it's leading to these changes in your cognition. So oftentimes it's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? And it's kind of hard to say, but we just know that these two components are really interrelated to each other.
Betty, that was really interesting when you're talking about how the cognitive changes can also affect the emotions, because you mentioned like the word finding can lead to frustration, especially like in a difficult conversation. I was also thinking about the other way around too. Like, do we also see that people, when they're feeling like really like nervous or anticipating like a difficult conversation with their MS, that it can also maybe affect their word finding or other things that are already being impacted?
Yeah, absolutely. I often hear people tell me that exact thing. They're nervous. They want to have a conversation. Maybe they aren't being as social as they used to be, so they feel really nervous. And it's kind of like they have this like wall, like a mental block, and then that can lead to an ability to find the word that they want to say. So absolutely, it works both ways. Okay, so moving on in terms of cognition, MS can impact any part of the brain. So any of those cognitive and emotional functions can be impaired. It's not going to pick out, maybe it can just impact anything. It's not, specifically going after one thing or another. The emotional changes, like me and Amber were talking about, it can occur on its own, but it can also be as a result of grief and just feeling those changes that you're going through. We're not talking about physical changes, but that's also something that can trigger some of these emotional changes as well. So oftentimes it can feel like grief, and then it can also just be due to just changes in who you used to be, this new normal. There's a lot of things that are going on, a lot of changes that can result in the emotional changes. And then the symptoms can just vary from mild to severe. It can even just vary from different life stages. Maybe you're going through a particular change in work status, change in how independent you are. So at some points in life, these things may not feel so severe, but in other aspects, if you're changing, like, I don't know, going from full-time to part-time, or maybe you're not able to do as much anymore, the symptoms can be more severe. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about how cognition impacts communication. So like I said earlier, because your attention can be impacted, it can be hard to focus in a conversation. You're trying to have this conversation with a loved one or a child or a friend, and not being able to focus can really impact what you're trying to say. Staying on topic, sometimes because of the cognitive changes, it can be hard to stay focused and stay on topic about what it is that you're trying to say. You may just jump from one thing to the next. And even taking turns. You may struggle with maybe being able to voice your opinion or letting someone else say what they need to say. The other big thing that can happen with your communication is remembering information. So maybe there is something that you want to say to someone and you just can't remember what it is. So that can negatively impact a conversation, especially having tough conversations. Sometimes when you have a cognitive change, we talked about executive functions. One of the things that fall under executive functions is what we call insight and awareness. So that's someone's ability to really understand what's going on and being aware of what's happening. with MS, sometimes that can change. You may not have as much awareness about what's going on. You may not understand how much of a deficit you're experiencing or having, or how it impacts somebody else. So that kind of reduced insight and awareness can really, affect how someone feels and how you communicate in a conversation. You may not know what this other person's talking about, so that's something to consider as well. When we go back to word finding, it can be difficult to organize your thoughts and find the right words. So like we talked about just a few minutes ago, that can be equally frustrating and cause and trigger anxiety and nervousness and vice versa. And then processing speed. You may need more time to comprehend and process information when you're talking to a loved one, and that other person may not understand that. So being aware that you may need more time could be something that could be communicated. And then last but not least is the brain fog. A lot of times with MS, and we may not go into a ton of detail with like the fatigue and things like that, but oftentimes it can just lead to brain fog. Things just don't feel clear. You may feel rested and get all the sleep and do all the right things, but that brain fog can just make it really hard to kind of get everything together. Someone once explained it to me as like, you just feel like it's like a jigsaw. Everything's just all over the place. It's kind of hard to kind of organize and bring things together. So in summary, what we're trying to say here is these cognitive deficits can really impact how you communicate something important to a loved one. So if you're trying to explain how MS works and how MS makes you feel, if you're having difficulty with attention and memory and processing speed, it can be really hard to convey your thoughts. So by understanding what's going on in your brain, hopefully it can help you communicate things easier or find an alternative way to communicate. All right, so kind of reiterate what I'm already saying, the effects of MS can really impact your ability to work, your ability to contribute to your family, your ability to be independent, and that may result in needing more support and needing more help. And when that happens, your loved ones can have a hard time kind of grasping that change. Sometimes MS can be really invisible. You may be going to work and appear to be functioning just fine. So it's hard for loved ones, children, caregivers to really understand what's going on. So it's important that we are able to have like the right tools to communicate what's going on and communicate, I'm having a memory issue and this is how it's impacting my ability. So understanding what's going on can really help that communication. So I think, is this your slide, Amber?
No, but I can talk about it.
No, I wasn't sure where we're transitioning off. I'm sorry. So let's talk a little bit more communication barriers. So again, this is just kind of going back to what we were already saying. When cognition is impaired, communicating changes can be difficult due to the brain fog, the memory and attention deficits, finding the right words, and slowed processing speed. The other thing I didn't really go into detail is how information is heard. So when you're talking to someone, how are you hearing the information? It may sound one way, but really the other person's trying to say something else. So it's also something to consider. MS can impact how you process and how you hear things too. So it's important to keep that communication line very open and understanding as well.
All right. Yes.
This is where you jump in.
But it all flows. I'm Dr. Amber Landers. I'm a clinical psychologist and I am in the Oakland area. And so thinking about some of the things that Betty said in terms of the way communication can be difficult with family members, it's also not just family members too, right? And so other situations where it can be difficult because of the cognitive or the emotional piece of MS, but also the cognitive and emotional piece of the situation itself. Can be speaking with your healthcare team, getting a lot of information or getting new information, or try to communicate your needs or your experiences with your physician, your nurse, neurologist, front desk staff. Even that word finding difficulty can come up there, and that can make that difficult. We talked about families and loved ones, so that could be anyone really: partners, spouse, siblings, children. Parents, I see some things popping up in the chat and folks talking about, wanting their loved ones to watch this video later. It's a great idea. Friends even. And also some folks in this list may know more or less about your MS. And so that might impact how you share things with them, what you tell them about things that are affecting you or how it affects you. At work can be really difficult too. A lot of folks that I hear from actually don't feel comfortable sharing their MS at work. And so it doesn't mean that the communication difficulties aren't happening. It might just be difficult to provide a context for that. And so that can be really hard with coworkers or with even managers, or maybe you're in a customer facing position. And so with customers or clients, that can be difficult as well. And then running errands and completing tasks. So that could be as simple and maybe not so simple, but as talking to the cashier, phone calls, maybe, your internet provider, you have to call them and ask for something, or ordering food even. All those things that Betty mentioned in terms of the word finding, the executive functioning, and even the emotional piece can come up in lots of different situations that can make communication very difficult. So like there's cognitive and emotional things that affect communication, there's also internal and external factors that impact communication. Internal might be like the goals that we set for ourselves about what this communication is going to accomplish. Maybe our goals might end up being too high, and that's okay. We can always kind of bring it back down. Our self-awareness of how we're feeling. I think that showed up in the chat as well. How does my body feel right now or today? Is this the right time for me to have this conversation? How is my mood right now or today? Self-awareness about when we communicate, like what is our tone or what is the tone of the other person? What is my body language conveying? Are those things that I have control over or not? Do I explain that to someone or not? But just being kind of aware can help us understand and also be prepared for any difficulties that we might be having. Active listening is really helpful in terms of asking clarification questions, paraphrasing if possible what the person said. I know if there's memory or attention, that can be hard, but even paraphrasing fragments as they come in, like I think I heard you say this, did I get that right? And those are kind of considered internal a little bit. Those are kind of the things that you might do that you feel like you have like control over. Preparation is kind of in the middle, like that's kind of something that you might have control over or that you can try to have control over, but that might also depend on the situation. And more external things are like environment, right? So what is the environment? We talked about a whole bunch of settings just a couple of slides ago, healthcare, family, but also like, what is it? Is it, your office, like your place of work? Is it a large open space where there's like people watching, an audience? Is it a quiet space? And what kind of space do you need to convey whatever it is that you're conveying? Is it with a spouse? And maybe you're not going to do that at a party in front of other people. Maybe you're going to do that at home. It depends. And that's something that sometimes we don't think about. What is the environment that I want to have this conversation in if I can control it? External might be the audience. Who's your audience, right? Is it coworkers? Is it family? Is it healthcare? Is it children, right? Because that might impact how you deliver your message. And also what you say in terms of preparation or how you prepare for that message as well. And time, I think time is really important too, because often when we're rushed, we also feel stressed, right? So if you're seeing your healthcare provider and you feel rushed, you may have more finding difficulty because you're feeling rushed and you're feeling stressed. Even with family members, or even I would say maybe tasks and responsibilities, a lot of things are rushed. That may also impact some of the other experiences that folks have. On the other hand, if we can plan for that, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. We can think about how we want to use the time or what we focus on or how we prepare people for what our concerns are, what we're responding to, or what we're about to say. But some of the external things are not so much within our control. And so those are things that are more about like preparation, planning, and sometimes even just acceptance that this might happen. And how am I going to cope with that or deal with that or tell the other person that this is going to happen? And so it can be helpful also as you're preparing for difficult conversations to think about the different types of difficult conversations that you might be having. And you may not even know there's different types. This is just two, but there's other ones too. Crucial conversations are typically a discussion between two or more people where the stakes are high, opinions may vary, and emotions are strong, right? Crucial conversations. Crucial confrontations are face-to-face conversations in which someone is held accountable. That's the kind of the main definition, but that also could be a face-to-face conversation in which a need is expressed or a request is expressed, right? You're saying, I need this thing, I'm requesting this thing. Again, that could be healthcare. That could be family. That could be at work as well. I need accommodations, right? And so the accountability is more that you're making a request or you're sharing a need. I think that when we think about difficult conversations, we're often thinking about the first one only, which is the crucial conversation, which might be settling a disagreement or having a difference of opinion about something. But there's these different types, and that can help with preparation as well. Regardless, everyone kind of has difficult conversations and they occur across different settings. They can occur with acquaintances, familiar people. They can occur with unfamiliar people, like the folks at the markets, or making that phone call to your internet provider to turn back your internet on or something. Either way, they can still be experienced as uncomfortable. No matter how many times we do it, they can still be experienced as uncomfortable. And I think that allowing permission to be uncomfortable kind of helps a little bit with some of the emotional aspects. Not always, but sometimes we put a lot of pressure on ourselves for things to go smoothly, and it's okay that they're not going to. We can prepare for it still. We can try to make it go as smooth as possible, but I think that it's okay to give folks permission, yourselves permission, that you can be uncomfortable, you can be worried, you can be nervous about it, and you're also going to prepare for it too.
So, Amber, I have a quick
Yes.
question. Well, would it be helpful? I know when I talk to patients about word finding, I always tell them to just like you talked about goals, right? I always tell them to think about the big picture goal. It may not come out the way you want it to, but what's the ultimate goal? Would you say that's kind of the same thing you're saying too? Like just putting it out there that it's going to be uncomfortable, but my goal is to just say, convey X, Y, and Z. Would that be
Yeah.
helpful? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Sometimes it's not going to be everything. It's just going to be X, Y, and Z, right? What's the big picture goal? At the end of this conversation, what's the main thing that I will want to have conveyed? What's the main request or the main thing that I want to have said or the main piece of information I want to have gathered? And that kind of relieves a little bit of the pressure to focus kind of on that main thing. Yeah.
Got it.
Mm-hmm. And, for the situations that we described and what some folks are putting in the chat, many of those situations are not one-time situations. It's like the store clerk and the making the phone call to the internet company, going to the gym maybe and saying hi to someone that's a stranger. Those might feel like one-time things, and they probably are. But the family, the healthcare are often more than one time. And so if you don't get it right the first time, it's going to be very frustrating, yes, but there's probably another opportunity to try again. And again, focus on that main kind of goal of XYZ. So part of self-awareness is also knowing how we and how others respond to difficult conversations, because that can also help us prepare. So types of responses include like avoiding, and I will say that there's pros and cons to all of these. So it's not like there's one right one, there's pros and cons, and it can be helpful in our tool belt to understand when we can or should or want to use any of these and understand kind of what can happen from that. So avoiding can be helpful when emotions are high. It's okay to pause on something. It's okay to say, I'm not going to address that today. I don't feel well today. I'm not going to address that today. I'm upset today. I'm going to come back to it. Or the issue is minor and it's like, it doesn't feel like it's worth it, right? The con is that the problem could grow. Maybe it's minor now, but if we're not like tracking it, maybe it grows, right? And maybe once your emotions are lower, maybe it's a better time to come to it, or maybe the situation will grow. So just knowing that. Accommodating is useful if the goal is kind of like harmony versus conflict. And maybe that happens, maybe with a partner or family members or something, accommodating, or just, letting the person do whatever it is that they're doing. If it's not so harmful, maybe it's fine. Accommodating can also mean showing accountability if we're wrong. If we, I don't know, if we thought someone said something and they didn't really say that, right? And say, oh, I thought that's what you said. My bad. Excuse me. I'm sorry. If we're too accommodating too much of the time, our needs may not be met. And sometimes resentment grows because we are, just accommodating for harmony all the time, but our needs are not being met. Competing is kind of like being assertive, right? And that can be really helpful in emergent situations. You have some new information and you want to respond to it, or really, really important issues, like really, really something that's really important and meaningful to you. Just understand that could be too forceful, but that's the balance. It just depends. Compromising is negotiating, usually between equivalent powers. So that might be with a spouse, maybe with a coworker, depending on the power dynamic. And it's helpful because it sometimes shows that balance of power, like we can compromise on this. The con is kind of on based on a set amount of resources. It's not really gathering in new information. It's like, this is what we know right now. Like, let's compromise, right? I know that I'm tired and I don't really want to go, to this family event or something like that. And the family knows that I'm tired as well. But they really want me to go. Okay, maybe I'm going to go for just an hour and I'm going to leave, and they're going to understand that that's my compromise, right? And so that's what it is. No new information, no new problem solving, no new idea, just working with what you have. Collaborating is kind of like that, but it can be creative in finding new solutions. So allowing for finding new information and where all parties might contribute to a solution. The con can be, if we're really looking for like one right answer, it can be frustrating because when we're collaborating, there's no correct response because all new ideas can come in. So again, I want to go to this family event, but I'm really, really tired. Collaboration, a new idea might be, well, what if we bring the party to you, right? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe you really don't want to go. What if we have it on this other day? So that's bringing in new kind of ideas to the situation, and there's no right answer. You still have to make a choice involving all parties, what it is that you're going to do and what's the impact of that as well. So again, these are not right or wrong. It's just these are all kind of ways that folks respond. And there's different outcomes, and there's ways that we can use these things strategically, also maybe based on how we're feeling and what's going on and who we are communicating with as well. The slide is called Resolving Conflict, but part of the slide is about conflict is inevitable. And sometimes it's not actually going to be resolved. And that's when we think about the large goal piece. Is it that I want to make sure that I'm saying what my needs are and the person knows that I just said it? Do I want a response or a reaction? And it's the same kind of negotiation of what is the goal, right? So it is inevitable, right? And it is uncomfortable. Conflict can lead to positive things. Maybe someone learned something, a family member or someone learned something that they didn't know, or they change their behavior. It can also be negative. Maybe there's a relationship rupture, and for the time being, that's just what it is for now. The results are likely to be better with active engagement rather than avoidance. And that's just if avoidance goes on too long, right? Because the problem probably will grow if there is a problem. People have to be motivated to address a conflict, and that goes for all the parties involved, which goes to that complication, like what if someone is not? And that's just kind of what it is. The great thing is that there can be some skills that can be acquired. I'm going to share some tips in a minute. It does require some self-awareness, which I think folks are definitely demonstrating today, and they're taking these polls and kind of responding. And in order, if there is a conflict, it's really helpful if the environment is neutral and feels safe for everyone involved. And that can be hard to figure that out. And that's why I said, like, for instance, if you're going to tell your spouse something, doing it in front of an audience, right, at a restaurant, at someone's birthday party, may not be the right place to do it, right? If you want to talk to your boss, maybe you have to decide, does it make sense to do that in the meeting, or does that make sense to do that in an individual meeting to, I don't know, convey something or ask for something or correct something even. So figuring out what is the neutral and safe place can be difficult, but really helpful if it's possible.
Mhm.
And so preparation is really helpful, especially for some of the things that Betty mentioned, word finding difficulties and executive functioning. And so if you know you're going to have a difficult conversation or are anticipating it, it can be helpful to prepare. So writing down key points or key goals, making a list of your concerns, your requests, or your needs. Now, remember, this is a list of your concerns, not of the other person's fault, which may not get you too far. Also, it could be really helpful if you have ideas about a solution. You can make that list ahead of time too. Mentioning the neutral location can be really helpful. And because this can really be emotionally charged or create emotions within us, practicing some relaxation techniques ahead of time is not just helpful for the emotional piece, but can be helpful physically too, in terms of like calming down the body and that parasympathetic response, getting that going, so that any additional stress from the actual conversation itself can be buffered like a little bit, at least a little bit.
I also had an idea that came to mind. Just going through the comments, people were talking about like creating lists and typing can be difficult. I've also suggested that people record their audio. So maybe if you're feeling good and you're not fatigued at that certain point in time and you know exactly what you just record it, make a voice memo. That could be a great way to share it at a later time when you're not feeling so nervous or anxious or, you know, walking into a conversation. Maybe jot it down or record it at a time where you're feeling more clear-headed. Would that be, I mean, would that be a good way to share information? I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, technology, there are some things that I don't even know about, right? That people probably can use. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I see lots of people sharing things.
Yeah. Someone mentioned Chat GPT, and that is, I didn't even think about that, but yeah, you could even just use that to see if it could, you know, come up with a way to communicate. That's great.
Yeah, I see voice memos. Yeah. I mean, maybe even recording yourself, you know, like, I mean, yeah.
Making a video, yeah.
Making a video, like, my mom has, I don't know, she has something where it's not FaceTime, but I can call her and leave a video message. And sometimes if I don't really want to have a conversation, this is recorded, she's gonna watch this, but I might send a video message instead, you know? And that way you kind of have control over what you're saying and how you're saying it. You can delete it if you don't like it, you can do it again. So yeah.
Yeah, that could definitely help if people are talking over you. I know that's something common that people struggle with, is being talked over or getting interrupted. So yeah, I think that's great. Like recording a video, you can just say, here, I'm going to play this and explain this to you.
Absolutely. Yeah. They're great ideas. Yeah. So did you know, tidbit, silent and listen have the same letters. They're anagrams. If you move the letters around, same letters. What? So active listening, right, is actually like an action that involves helping to understand the process, the content, and feelings of another person. The process is like how the communication goes, what's going on for that person, might be what their thought process. The content is the actual words that are coming out. And the feelings, of course, are kind of the emotions, right? And sometimes not saying anything is saying a lot, and really helpful even too. Nonverbal listening, again, is our body language, our utterances, nodding, things like that. Non-judgmental listening is also part of active listening, pausing, paraphrasing what I'm hearing you say is, and that can be a tip or skill for also finding points in the conversation to do that, to also help with memory and also help with tracking. What I'm hearing you say is this, and what I'm hearing you say is that. Did I get that right? You know, it's active listening, but it can also be strategically done to also kind of have these like markers in the conversation that are kind of like memory markers a little bit. Now, when I read this slide, I know that I'm thinking that some people are like, well, what about the other person? And yes, unfortunately, we don't have control over the other person. I hope the other person is also skilled in active listening. and maybe they're not. And so that is a limitation, right? Most of these conversations obviously involve more than one person. But if we're using active listening, it can be helpful. It can also be modeling. Maybe the person picks up on it. And it can also help still move the conversation in a direction that you're trying to get it to go through. Because if you're showing empathy and you're paraphrasing, sometimes it's a clue to the other person, oh, like, wait, let me also do this thing too. Empathy is, it can be something like, I can understand how the situation can be frustrating. I know this is not what you wanted to hear. Now, I shared those examples because empathy doesn't mean agreeing. It just means saying, I understand where you're coming from with that, and X, Y, and Z. I know this is not what you wanted to hear, but I really can't make that event tonight. I'm just too kind of tired. I understand how the situation can be frustrating, but this is what I really need to do, right? Or these are the steps that I think we should follow next, right? So. And then tips for good communication, I statements over you or them statements. Again, you can't control the other person, but you can try to create a communication environment that is a little bit safer for you and the other person, and that gets you heard. I have a mentor that says, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? And I think about that when I kind of think about the way we communicate with folks. You can think about when someone is doing this to you and saying, well, you did this and you don't do that and you don't listen to me. Like, how do you feel? How do you respond? And so we want to try not to do that. A more effective way is I'm feeling la, 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 la when this thing happens, right? Or you always plan these things at the end of the day and you know that I'm tired because blah, 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 blah. Or I get tired at the end of the day, so I won't be able to come to that event, right? Repeat back what the other person said before sharing your perspective. I hear you saying this, Betty, and I wanted to add to that and say this thing, right? Assume good, and if that's hard to do, assume no attentions. Assume people are doing the best that they can with the skills that they have, right? And maybe people need more skills. The folks you're working with at work or wherever it is, maybe they need more skills, right? And so if we take it from being personal, it can help with the kind of the emotional piece as well. If the conversation can wait, this is kind of useful avoidance. If the conversation can wait, then ask for a good time to talk, right? You can all think about a time. Well, let me use I instead of you. I can think about times where I've said, I need to talk, right? And the reaction that I get, right, is like panic, right? And so you might want to ask for a good time to talk. And also, you want to make sure that the person is in a space to kind of listen if it's something that can wait. If it's immediate, then maybe it just has to happen. But if it can wait, you can ask, I need to talk about X, Y, and Z. Is there a good time for us to talk about that, right? And you want a good time for yourself too. Maybe the morning is better. Maybe the evening is actually better for you. And then it is helpful to give a preview of what you're about to say. And this helps, again, in preparation as well. Going back to my example of I need to talk, it's very vague, and that can create a lot of angst in folks versus I need to talk about, I don't know, my next appointment that I have, or I need to talk about our plans for how we're going to do this vacation thing that's coming up, or I need to talk about my workspace situation, right? And so you give someone a preview of what you're going to say. Yeah. And so just some tips to take with you, just really quick tips. SFS, situation, feeling, solution. So situation is describe the situation, feeling is name the emotion, and solution is presenting some solutions or alternatives. So I have some examples for you in the next slide. And so some healthcare team, it's hard for me to remember everything. And when you ask me if I have questions at the end of the appointment, I feel rushed. I'd like to talk about my questions at the beginning of the appointment so that I do not forget them, right? And if you're, following along, you can throw in the chat, what do you think the emotion is and what you think the solution is, right? And if you put in there feeling rushed, maybe, right? That would be a great observation here. And maybe the solution that the person is saying is talking about questions at the beginning, starting with questions, right? So, and they started off with the situation. It's hard for me to remember when you ask me if I have questions at the end. So I have another example for you too that I'll just go through pretty quickly. This is family loved ones, which can be difficult. When you're watching TV while I'm trying to describe my doctor's visit to you, I get distracted. I feel like what I'm saying is not important to you. Can we set aside a time where we can give each other our full attention without distractions, and I can describe what happened at my visit, right? I added the we in there because sometimes that's helpful, but you can say, I'd like to set aside a time. You can use I still. I'd like to set aside a time where I can have your full attention without distractions. That's fine too. And so the situation here is when you're watching TV, the feeling is kind of like distracted and feeling like that what I'm saying is not important. And the solution is, can we find a time where there are no distractions, right? And then some other tips here. Again, people love acronyms, right? For me, actually, acronyms don't help me remember. But maybe they'll help someone out there in the audience. But value means validate, ask open-ended questions, listen. Uncover interest is more like find out what other people think, and then explore options is like kind of the finding the solution part. And then AMP is more about active listening, so asking questions, doing that paraphrase thing back, mirroring, which is similar to that. Priming is like if the person is not responding, then you can kind of prompt them or kind of make a guess at what they might be experiencing. I imagine that I've shared a lot of information with you and it can be overwhelming. I'm imagining that you're taking some time to think about it, right? So you can kind of prime, kind of guess what the person might be thinking or responding to if they're not giving you a response, right? And this works kind of well with I think with teenagers sometimes because they may not want to tell you what they're thinking, but I imagine that, I don't know, what I'm saying to you makes you a little bit worried and kind of wondering how you feel about that, something like that, or imagining that this might feel embarrassing for you when we're in public, I don't know. And so I'm just kind of wondering how you deal with that, And these are just some references. They'll be in the slide deck if you're interested in where some of this information came from.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was awesome information. And now's the time that we get to look at some questions. So we've had some questions coming into the question and answer tab here. First question, who would be the best professional to get help with cognitive issues related to communication?
I'm going to just jump in and say someone like me. A lot of people don't realize the purpose of a speech language pathologist. Oftentimes people think we're there to help you talk in terms of your speech, but I would say if you have access to a speech language pathologist, they can definitely assess the cognitive deficits and give you strategies. Oftentimes they may not be available in your area, so it may be worthwhile to look through, the MS foundations, things like that, even asking your healthcare provider if they know of a speech language pathologist, or even I think a psychologist could help too, just depending on their, scope and things like that. But definitely a speech therapist can help with that.
Yeah, I think a psychologist too. I think that with the psychologist, because they're kind of more general, letting them know that that's a goal, and then they can kind of focus more on that. Yeah.
Right. So we also have some people wondering about how to just talk and explain what MS is to their loved ones, including adults, as well as maybe their kids or grandkids. Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah. I don't have a real good answer, but when I think about talking to kids, sometimes it's helpful to find out, and this is for other topics that people have asked me about, but sometimes it's helpful to find out what they already know or what they've already heard, because sometimes they have an idea of something and maybe it's not true. Maybe it's a scarier thing in their head than what it really is. And so then you can address what they think already and fill in gaps rather than feeling like you're starting from scratch. But that can be hard to know. But I think that with kids, sometimes it's great to start with questions sometimes, and then fill in the gaps there.
Yeah, I would agree. I think just knowing where someone's at is a good place. Maybe I don't know about a child necessarily, but maybe someone has gone and kind of asked around to kind of get an idea. So acknowledging that they are trying to understand is important. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And then I had somebody ask about the pseudobulbar effect, and how that affects just communicating with people on a general basis, especially people that they don't know very well.
I don't know. I'm trying to think on that one. I don't know if Amber, if you have any suggestions on pseudobulbar.
I was going to pass that on to you.
It's a hard one.
Yeah.
It is. With pseudobulbar, I think what's challenging about that, I think that goes into like the emotional lability piece. And that is challenging because you may not be aware that you're doing it or that you're having like this reaction that may not be appropriate. So
Mhm.
I think it just depends on having someone that you trust that you can talk to about it, where you're not feeling like they're mocking you or being critical. So I think it's important in those situations to have someone that you can trust that you can definitely go to and say, like, is my response appropriate? Is it not appropriate? Um, that I think, yeah, that's a tricky one because someone may not feel comfortable even pointing it out that you're having this response.
And can you just give like the briefest of definitions of what that effect is?
The pseudobulbar effect, it is kind of when you have like episodes that are just kind of like, from what I understand, like uncontrollable laughter, uncontrollable crying. It's just kind of this response that you can't like regulate as easily. You know, if you're sad, you may be just really, really sad. Or if you're laughing, you may just laugh uncontrollably, or it could just happen in an inappropriate situation.
Mhm. Something that you said is making me think of some of the things in the chat that sometimes, and then it's part of the kind of the self-awareness piece, having an ambassador that you feel comfortable with, that can one be your eyes in the sky, right? This happened, but also your ambassador for those times where maybe you are not feeling as effective in communicating, and maybe it's a person that you trust to do that for you or to practice with you if you're preparing. I know that's hard for folks. I see a lot of things in there where it's kind of hard for folks to have that person, but I also see it a lot in the chat where folks are kind of saying they have like a person that they kind of trust. And ambassadors are great. Sometimes we need an ambassador.
Mm-hmm. I think even I'm just watching the chat, people are trying to connect and find support in social groups that they can kind of have that person. I know oftentimes having that peer support is having that ambassador. Like another person with MS may not have those exact same issues, but just knowing that they understand the disease can be super helpful. Just to kind of bounce off ideas or thoughts and feelings, things like that.
Absolutely. And people have put some really great
Mm-hmm.
suggestions in the chat. Different organizations have support groups, both virtual and online. And then this is a great time to just plug our other programs, our Jumpstart program and our YQA. Those programs, you are actually on the screen, can ask questions, can talk to each other, and get information from each other in that capacity. So we'd love to have you join us if you haven't before. Let's see, got one more question. Okay, so we've got a couple different questions about cultural differences with communication. Very general, but we've got someone who has a spouse who's of a different color. They have a different cultural background. We've had a couple people talk about different cultural backgrounds and barriers within communication. I know that's pretty vague, but would either of you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of, I mean, I feel like that could have its own webinar in itself,
Yep.
right? I think that's challenging. I think, like Amber was saying earlier, meet them where they are. What do you know? Or yeah, I think it's kind of understanding just from different cultures, people have different ways of communicating. Some cultures are more communicative than others. Some people kind of hold in more emotions because that's kind of how their culture is or how they were raised. So I think it's having an understanding of where the other person is can kind of help with that communication. That's where I would start. Because people are raised differently, have different beliefs, things like that. I've had patients tell me, it's hard to communicate with the family member because of like a cultural barrier, being strong and not, showing you're fatigued and things like that can be really challenging. So I think it's kind of hopefully coming together and kind of using that compromise technique that Amber talked about earlier to kind of meet in the middle is what I would suggest. But it is challenging. It can be very like a sticky situation.
Yeah, I think that that can be a whole nother webinar in itself. I
Mhm.
was very purposeful about not including everything in active listening because I'm aware that like eye contact means different things in different cultures, and hand gestures and things might show that you're using nonverbal listening, but it can also feel, invasive. And so it does kind of depend. And sometimes we don't know that stuff until it comes up. And so, yeah, meeting people where they're at. I think it's really helpful. It's been helpful for me when folks, again, prepare for the conversation and say, hey, I tend to use my hands a lot. It doesn't mean I use my hands a lot, but I use my hands a lot. It doesn't really mean anything. I've gotten feedback about it. But that's just a thing that I do to convey how I'm talking. And I'm like, cool, all right. And I know that depends on the audience, how comfortable people feel giving a preface, and what reaction I think they're going to get. But that could be a strategy as well, too.
Great. Thank you for that quick overview. I appreciate it. All right. So we are at the top of the hour. Just because this webinar is over, we still want to be connected with you. If you can follow us on social media, we've got our latest programs, we've got more resources, we've got MS News that we're sharing all the time. Also register for our monthly e-news. If you don't, it's just an email that goes out once a month with all the happenings that we have going on for the month. We also just want to thank our sponsors one more time for this awesome program. Thank you again to Amber and Betty for being here with us this evening. And thank you to everyone who's watching tonight. We hope this information has been helpful and we hope to see you again. Have a great night.